Good morning. Today is the 27th day of Nisan, the 5th of May. And we're starting a new parsha, Kedoshim, which literally means those who are holy. And, as might be expected, most of the content of this week's reading is related to being holy. So let's read the first two verses. We're looking at Leviticus 19:1. God spoke to Moses, saying, "Speak to the entire congregation of the Israelites, saying to them, you must be holy, for I, God your God, I, Havaya your God, am holy. Kedoshim tiyu ki kedosh ani." Now, the first thing we might think is that, well, to become holy, a person needs to be detached from the world. And we know that there are such systems that they feel that by detaching from the world, by not having attachments, by being celibate, by being ascetic, one reaches a higher level of spirituality. But Judaism takes a different approach to this. And we know that there's this principle, Kadesh atzmecha b'mutar lecha, that you should sanctify yourself in all those things that are permitted, everything that's permissible. And you should strive to reach holiness, a state of holiness, through living in the world, and not by detaching from it. What we want to look at today is a classic intellectual Chabad approach to becoming holy. This week we're probably going to mention him a number of times. In 1777, just a year after the War of Independence in the United States, the successor of the Maggid of Mezrich, the successor of the Baal Shem Tov, whose name was Rabbi Menachem Mendel Vitebsk, made Aliyah to the land of Israel with 200 families from Russia. Now, for that to happen in 1777 is comparable to maybe 100,000 or 200,000 people coming all at once today. It was not an easy thing to do. And they ended up in the beginning in Pki'in, then in Tzfat, and finally in the end they moved to Tiberias. And he passed away 11 years later in Tiberias. That's where he's buried, on the first of the month of Iyar, which is going to be this week on Thursday. So there's a very strong connection between Menachem Mendel Vitebsk, the first Hasidic Rebbe of the land of Israel, and Chabad, because he was also the Rebbe of Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Liadi, the founder of Chabad. And in fact, Rabbi Shneur Zalman wanted to go with him to the land of Israel in 1777, and he wouldn't allow him. He stopped him. And he told him, you have to continue leading the people here in Russia. And that's what he did. And the connection between the disciple and the student, and on some accounts it was like two students of the Maggid, they had a very complex relationship, continued until his passing 11 years later in 1788. Once he passed away, he was buried in Tiberias, and Rabbi Ginsburg especially has a special connection because of a year that he spent in Tiberias. And so this week on Wednesday night will be commemorating his passing in Tiberias. In his teaching on this week's Parsha, he begins by contemplating what does it mean to be holy. And he says something, again, in the tradition of the intellectual Hasidic stream of thought of Chabad. And he says that to be holy is to be wise. holiness and wisdom always go together. Kadosh and Chacham, Chokhmah. Just as understanding and purity, Binah and Tahara, also go together always. These are two very well-known correspondences in the world of the Zohar. So again, the Vitebsker writes, to be holy means to be wise. What does he mean by being wise? He explains. He says there are two types of contemplation that a person can contemplate an idea. There's the type of contemplation which is to settle the idea in the mind, to really integrate it, to, we might say, even stabilize it in the mind so that it becomes part of the repertoire of how a person thinks. And the person could spend a lot of time on this, but in principle, the notion is that he is introducing the idea into his mind. He's, as it were, swallowing this idea. He's making it part of himself. That is contemplation that is related to what we call tivuna. Tivuna literally means contemplation, and it means, again, collecting nuggets of knowledge, nuggets of introspection, of understanding that accumulate in our minds. And they form the way that our mind thinks. They make our frame of reference for the world, the way that we see the world. But explains, the Vitebsker, there is another form of meditation, for lack of a better word. Meditation literally means to think, so it's actually a very good word, but it's sort of been hijacked by Eastern traditions. And so today people think about meditation as being a quieting of the mind or emptying of the mind. And here we don't mean that. We mean that a person is so immersed in a teaching, in an idea. Again, the image here is that the person's mind is in the idea. He's immersed in it. He finds himself surrounded by it. And he's so deeply concentrating on this idea and so completely immersed in it that he can spend 3 days and 3 nights not eating and not drinking, only contemplating this, and reaching a state in which he doesn't know whether it's day or night. Says the Vitebsker, this is what it means to be a holy person. If you can't do this, then you might be a great scholar, you might be very pedantic about your observance of the commandments, and so on, but he says holy you can't be yet. To be holy is to be able to use this type of thinking, which is called wisdom. And we said wisdom and holiness go together. And to be able to hold a thought, to be immersed within it for 3 days and 3 nights straight, without eating or drinking, without knowing what exactly is even around you, whether it's day or night. Being completely oblivious to your surroundings. That is the mark of a holy person. So he says. He goes further to explain, and this is a very important piece of information that he gives us, that when a person is truly using his wisdom to contemplate an idea and reaching a state of holiness, what he's actually doing is he's breaking the object of contemplation into smaller and smaller fragments, finer and finer elements, to the point where they seem to disappear. They become so small that he's reached the capability of the human mind to break something into its smaller and smaller elements. Small example may be that if I contemplate a word, and this is called the workings of the chariot in Kabbalistic meditation. So I would break the word up into its constituent letters. And then I would continue to break the letters up into their parts, and so on. Looking at every single element there, making it finer and finer, until I reach a state in which the mind cannot grasp anything any smaller than what I've contemplated already. At that moment, I can make the leap to godliness. Because godliness is revealed when we can break something up into its finest elements and then go beyond that, saying that godliness is not even in the details in that sense. It's beyond it, because godliness is incorporeal. It's not the physical. It's not even what the mind can contemplate. But I have to reach the end of the mind's capability in order to reach a cleaving and a connection with godliness. And this was actually the topic of last week's Torah reading. The beginning of the Torah reading was all about the Yom Kippur service. And we said that the highlight of the Yom Kippur service is bringing incense into the Holy of Holies. What was special about the incense in the temple? That the incense was ground finer and finer and finer and finer until it could not be ground anymore, until it was like dust. And if you remember, in the plagues that struck Egypt, it was the third plague when the Egyptian magicians tried to mimic Moses and Aaron and tried to make lice. But they couldn't. It was too small for them. The idea there wasn't that it was too small for them to see, or it was too small for them to understand. It was too small for them to manipulate. Meaning, at some point, you reach the non-being beyond the being. But to reach it, you have to get to finer and finer and finer contemplation and ideas and perception, until you finally let go of it entirely. And what the Vitebsker is saying is that takes 3 days and 3 nights. So 3 days and 3 nights of taking an idea, breaking it up as much as I can, further and further and further and further, until eventually I reach a state where I can just say, and God is beyond everything I've been able to grasp and contemplate with my mind. So this is a very novel type of take on what it means to be holy. That holiness passes through the effort of the mind, not just the effort of one's actions and how one comports oneself and so on, but also this ability to break things down, to contemplate them, to get down to the finer and finer resolutions of reality, as much as the mind can contemplate, and then leave it all and go beyond that to realize that God is not corporeal. He's not physical in the usual sense. He's not a body or the image of the body, as Maimonides would say. So thanks for joining today. Hope to see you tomorrow.